The story doesn't start with a rocket, it starts with a click. A single mouse click that changed Elon Musk's life forever. It was 2002, and eBay had just finalized the acquisition of PayPal for $1.5 billion in stock. Elon, who had been ousted as CEO of PayPal but still held a significant stake, walked away with a jaw-dropping $180 million in his bank account. For 99.9% of humanity, that's where the movie would fade to black. The hero, bruised but triumphant, sails off into early retirement. Cue the champagne and a yacht named Liquidated Assets. But Elon Musk was not most people. Instead of relaxing, he began pacing. Instead of upgrading to gold-threaded pajamas, he started Googling rocket science. And instead of buying a private island in the Bahamas, he drafted an Excel spreadsheet that would eventually lead him to the edge of financial ruin and into the stars. You see, Elon had always been fascinated by space. Not in the way kids are dreaming of floating in zero gravity with a juice box and a toy helmet, but in a bone-deep, adult obsession with the survival of the species. To him, the idea of humanity being a single-planet civilization was not just inefficient, it was dangerous. He believed we were sitting on a ticking time bomb, blissfully unaware of how fragile Earth's cradle really was. Climate change, pandemics, rogue AI, asteroid collisions, any one of these could wipe us out. His solution? Muffs. Colonize Mars. And he wasn't joking. At this point, it's important to understand something. Elon Musk had never built a rocket, not even a small one in his backyard. He didn't have a degree in aerospace engineering. He didn't have a background at NASA or a Rolodex full of military contractors. All he had was money, an iron will, and what some people would call a dangerous amount of optimism. He also had Google. In fact, much of his early education in rocketry came from hours of obsessive online reading. And this part is real, a trip to Borders bookstore where he picked up a copy of Rocket Propulsion Elements. That's right. The man who would one day launch astronauts into orbit started by browsing the science and technology aisle like a confused college freshman the night before finals. Most rational billionaires would have partnered with an established aerospace company, perhaps bought a controlling interest in Boeing or Lockheed Martin. Elon, he decided to start from scratch. He wanted full control. He wanted to innovate without bureaucracy. He wanted to fail fast, fix faster, and do things differently. That's how SpaceX, short for Space Exploration Technologies Corporation, was born. With a tiny office in El Segundo, California, and a small team of engineers who had no idea what they were getting into, Musk announced his plan to build a low-cost, reusable rocket that could send payloads, and eventually people, to orbit and beyond. To anyone in the industry, this was laughable. The launch business was notorious for being dominated by giants, rife with government red tape, and plagued by budgets that ran into the hundreds of millions for a single launch. New entrants. They were called paper companies, ideas that looked good on PowerPoint and died in the real world. Elon, however, didn't read that memo. He was busy sketching engine configurations on napkins and demanding to know why combustion chambers couldn't be welded cheaper. He poured more than $100 million of his own money into SpaceX, hiring the best people he could find, often convincing them during long walks or impassioned late-night calls. He wasn't just investing cash, he was investing identity. His name, his reputation, his entire fortune was now tied to the success of a company that had never flown a single thing into the sky. Friends thought he was spiraling. Critics thought he was reckless. Financial advisors probably had panic attacks in their sleep. But here's the thing, Elon Musk didn't care about being comfortable. He cared about being consequential. Still, behind the bravado was a man who, at times, was just as terrified as anyone else would be. He didn't admit it often, but the stakes were high, and the fear was real. What if the whole thing crashed and burned? What if he was remembered not as the visionary who took us to Mars, but as the guy who lit $100 million on fire in a desert? What if he ended up broke, mocked, and irrelevant? He carried those doubts with him. He just didn't let them win. One story goes that in those early days, when SpaceX was still testing engines in the Mojave Desert, Elon would sleep in a tiny trailer next to the test stand. While most executives would helicopter in for a photo op, Musk was in the trenches. If an engine exploded, he was there. If a valve stuck, he'd be on the floor with a wrench, or at least hovering close enough to make the engineers nervous. He demanded everything from his team, but he demanded even more from himself. They worked 80-hour weeks because he worked 100. He led with a mix of obsession, impatience, and relentless belief. And yet, despite all that intensity, there were moments of humor too. Once, when a supplier sent the wrong part, Elon personally called them and asked, "Do you realize this mistake might one day kill a Martian?" The supplier had no idea how to respond. There's no training for a billionaire calling to talk about Martian casualties. But this was the beginning of a journey unlike any other. A journey not born from comfort, but from discomfort, from the refusal to settle, from the belief that just because something sounds crazy doesn't mean it's wrong. Elon Musk had the money to escape the world. Instead, he used it to try and save it. And as we'll see in the next chapter of this story, building rockets is hard. Really hard. Especially when you don't just want to build them, you want to change the entire space industry while you're at it. The failures would be spectacular. The odds would be grim. And yet, Elon Musk was just getting started. You might think wealth brings peace. But Elon Musk was restless in a way that even $180 million couldn't soothe. He had the beach house, the car, the prestige. But he also had a relentless itch, an existential kind of discomfort that couldn't be dulled by material success. The world was comfortable resting on its technological laurels, but he wasn't. One single, infuriating question echoed louder than applause in his mind. Why haven't we gone to Mars yet? This wasn't idle musing or sci-fi fandom. It was, to Elon, a failing of imagination, a lack of courage, a threat to humanity's future. Instead of lounging in a villa or funding the next social media darling, he sat hunched over piles of aerospace engineering textbooks. Friends would walk in and find him tracing orbital mechanics with his finger across whiteboards or watching grainy NASA footage from the 1960s like it was the season finale of his favorite show. He devoured academic journals like they were spy novels. He wasn't an engineer, not formally, but the line between obsession and vocation blurred quickly. He started calling experts in propulsion systems, satellite architecture, oxidizers, anyone who might entertain his questions. Some answered, others laughed. Most didn't take him seriously, and that made him dig deeper. At dinner parties, Elon would drift away from conversation, lost in the math of mass ratios or re-entry heat shields. He'd scribble thrust equations on cocktail napkins. Once, during a private event in Napa Valley, a fellow entrepreneur teased him, "Still chasing Mars, Elon?" Musk only nodded and replied, "Someone has to." The room fell silent for a beat before laughter smoothed over the awkwardness. But Elon wasn't joking. The more resistance he faced, the more resolute he became. He tried to buy rockets, Russian ICBMs to be specific. It wasn't as crazy as it sounds. They were cheap, relatively speaking, and he needed something fast. But the negotiations collapsed. The Russians laughed him out of the room. Literally. On the flight home, Elon sat quietly, staring out the window of the jet as the sun dipped beneath the clouds. Then he turned to his companions and said, without irony, "I think we should build our own." Even they didn't believe him at first. And Elon, he was terrified. Underneath the calculated ambition was a gnawing dread. He didn't have an aerospace degree. He'd never built a rocket. He had no government contracts, no experience with launch regulations, and no guarantee that his plan wouldn't bankrupt him entirely. And yet, something deeper than confidence pushed him forward. A kind of moral obligation. A belief that waiting for someone else to act was the most dangerous decision of all. He was scared. But fear, to him, wasn't a stop sign, it was a compass. And it pointed straight into the unknown. He began quietly, assembling a team of engineers, scientists, and dreamers, some brilliant, others just crazy enough to believe in him. They rented a warehouse in El Segundo, bought scrap parts off eBay, and started sketching a rocket that could one day break Earth's atmosphere. The blueprints weren't just theoretical. Every line drawn, every bolt modeled, was a declaration, we're doing this. As the months rolled on, Elon poured his energy and his fortune into what many called a vanity project. but wasn't about vanity. He had nothing left to prove. This was about survival, human survival. He feared a future in which Earth became a single-point failure. And he believed fervently that multiplanetary life was the only insurance policy we had. Still, the doubts didn't go away. Late at night, he would sit alone, his desk cluttered with schematics, calculator still warm in his palm. He wondered if he was delusional, if his ambition had crossed the line into madness. The voice in his head, cold and clinical, whispered cruel things. You're going to lose everything. And yet, louder than that voice was another thought. Softer but more enduring. What if you don't try? What if no one does? That was the nightmare that truly haunted him. Not failure, but indifference. The idea that future generations might look up at the stars and wonder why we stopped trying. Why we surrendered our curiosity. Why we chose comfort over courage. So he pushed forward. He created Space Exploration Technologies Corporation, SpaceX, for short. The name itself felt both playful and prophetic. And suddenly, the dream was no longer a sketch. It was a company. It had payroll. It had burn rates. It had deadlines. And it had a founder who had staked nearly everything on its success. He wasn't building rockets to get rich. In fact, with every passing day, he got poorer. Venture capitalists wouldn't touch it. Banks wouldn't back it. The government barely noticed it. And yet, every time a part failed or a system glitch fried a test model, Elon didn't retreat, he doubled down. He fired off new questions to his engineers, stayed in the lab until dawn, and asked again and again, what did we learn? Because for him, that's what it was always about. Not perfect launches, but progress. Not fame, but forward motion. Elon Musk wasn't trying to escape Earth. He was trying to pull humanity forward. Even if he failed, even if no one else believed in him. Because he believed that trying, even in the face of impossible odds, was better than waiting for someone else to save us. And that belief, that stubborn flicker of hope in the dark, became the fuel that would one day lift something massive off the launch pad. But for now, it was just a whisper in a warehouse, a dream among soldering tools and makeshift engines, waiting for the moment it would ignite. SpaceX was born in a warehouse that smelled more like motor oil and burnt coffee than destiny. In El Segundo, California, tucked between car repair shops and anonymous tech startups, Elon Musk signed the lease on a building that didn't look like the birthplace of space travel. But that was part of the charm. No clean rooms, no government funding, no suits. This was Silicon Valley meets Mad Max. He wasn't creating a company, he was lighting a fuse. The building had stained concrete floors, mismatched chairs, and a leaky roof that dripped over a makeshift soldering station. But Elon loved it. It was real, raw, filled with just enough chaos to make it feel like something was being born. The team he built was a blend of brilliance and bravery, an oddball crew that included fresh-faced MIT grads still flush with theoretical knowledge, grizzled aerospace engineers who'd been burned by bureaucracies, and self-taught mechanics who could build a guidance system from car parts if you gave them a weekend. They weren't hired for their resumes. They were hired for their willingness to jump off a cliff with Elon and build the wings on the way down. Some slept on cots wedged between 3D printers and thrust chambers. Others hadn't been home in weeks, but they stayed, drawn by the promise of doing something that had never been done. Musk himself wasn't some distant CEO reading quarterly reports from a yacht. He was crawling under desks to install routers, unboxing electronics with his own hands, fixing broken espresso machines, and asking every question that crossed his mind. And there were a lot of questions. He was the kind of boss who would interrupt a lunch break with, "What if we switch to ablative shielding?" and expect a whiteboard sketch by dessert. He didn't come from the aerospace world, but that didn't stop him from becoming its most relentless student. And while he could be intense, terrifying, even, there was no denying his energy. Infected the building. There was a rhythm to those early days, mornings filled with caffeine and calculations, afternoons of trial and error, and late nights where the only thing more common than setbacks were pizza boxes stacked like thermal shielding in the corner. People slept at the warehouse. They showered at the gym down the street. Relationships frayed. Tempers flared. But no one left. Not yet. They were all chasing something bigger than themselves. They were chasing the impossible. They named the first rocket Falcon 1, a nod to the Millennium Falcon, because of course Elon would draw inspiration from science fiction. It was scrappy, narrow, and full of potential, just like the team that built it. But reality hit hard. Building a rocket wasn't about dreams. It was about details: fuel slosh dynamics, structural harmonics, burn rates, sensor faults. Everything was an obstacle. Everything wanted to explode. And often it did. The first launch attempt was a lesson in humility. Falcon 1 made it about 30 seconds into flight before spiraling like a doomed firework. The second attempt failed too, this time barely clearing the launch pad. Each failure was more than a mechanical issue. It was a hit to morale, a punch to the gut of everyone who had sacrificed comfort, stability, and in many cases, relationships to be part of this impossible thing. Elon took each blow personally, not in a self-pitying way, but in the way a captain feels responsible when the ship hits a reef. But Elon didn't flinch. He absorbed each failure like fuel. His confidence was unsettling, even to those who believed in him. After the third failure, a near-catastrophic loss that drained them emotionally and financially, one of the engineers broke down and said, "We gave it everything. Maybe it's time to stop." Elon looked him in the eyes and said, "I'm not stopping. Not unless I'm dead." It wasn't just a company anymore. It was a personal crusade. And Elon had already poured nearly every cent of his PayPal fortune into SpaceX. He wasn't dipping in. He was all in. When the fourth launch approached, the team was running on fumes, financially and emotionally. If it failed, there would be no fifth. No money. No backup. Just the legacy of a billionaire who thought he could build a rocket and flamed out instead. But despite the fear, there was a hum in the warehouse. A vibration of belief. Engineers triple-checked every line of code, every weld. Elon was there through it all, not barking orders, but pacing, studying, encouraging. He knew what was at stake. Not just for the company, for the dream, for the idea that private citizens could reach space without a government badge. That fourth launch in September 2008 changed everything. Falcon 1 lifted off, pierced the sky, and made it to orbit. Clean, controlled, real. For the first time, a privately funded company had delivered a liquid-fueled rocket to orbit. Cheers erupted. Grown men cried. Elon, he smiled quietly, eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion. He didn't shout. He didn't dance. He just exhaled, like he'd been holding his breath for 6 years. It wasn't triumph. Not yet. But it was proof. The spark had caught, and the world would never doubt him the same way again. They were no longer dreamers with soldering irons. They were pioneers. That warehouse, once stained and silent, now buzzed with new purpose. Because they had done it. They had reached space. And Elon Musk, once a tech mogul with a strange obsession, was now something else entirely. A man who proved the impossible wasn't. And gamble he did. Elon Musk didn't just invest a portion of his PayPal fortune. He lit on fire and hurled it at the stars. SpaceX got $100 million, almost his entire windfall. But Elon wasn't done playing roulette with destiny. Tesla received $70 million. Solar City? Another $10 million. It wasn't an investment portfolio. It was a high-stakes, all-in declaration of war against the mundane future everyone else was settling for. "I'd rather go down in flames than watch humanity stagnate," he repeated like a mantra. And the cosmos, mischievous as ever, seemed eager to test his resolve. Going down in flames, as it turned out, wasn't figurative. The first Falcon 1 launch in March 2006 turned the word failure into a pyrotechnic display. Less than a minute into flight, the rocket lost control and veered off course, crashing dramatically into the waters near Kwajalein Atoll. The dream of private spaceflight didn't gently stumble. It belly flopped in front of the world. The video footage showed a soaring hope suddenly swallowed by the sea. For Elon and his team, it felt like watching years of relentless labor and midnight ambition drown on live feed. Their hopes had launched and then promptly plunged. But Elon didn't retreat. He reloaded. The first thing he asked, why did it fail? The question rang like a bell through the hangar. There was no blame game, no finger pointing, just a whiteboard, an unrelenting debrief, and a man with tired eyes demanding better. By March 2007, they were back. Launch 2. This time, it lasted longer, almost heroically so. The first stage performed like a dream, but the second stage failed to separate. The rocket wobbled, then spiraled, and then gave up to gravity. Another multi-million-dollar firework. Critics sharpened their knives. Twitter, still in its infancy, mocked him. Headlines called him a delusional billionaire playing with real-life toys. Tech bro fantasy. Amateur hour in orbit. Elon didn't respond. Instead, he read every word, scribbled notes, and walked back into the engineering bay with the same question, what did we miss? He wasn't chasing revenge, he was chasing clarity. The third launch in August 2008 was a line in the sand. If the second failure had stung, this one bled. The rocket launched. It cleared the pad. Cheers started. And then, a few minutes in, contact. A fuel line malfunction caused a collision between the first and second stages. The rocket disintegrated mid-flight. Another spectacular failure. Another soul-crushing silence. The engineers sat frozen in front of monitors gone cold, their bodies still, their hearts numb. This wasn't just business anymore. Engineers had postponed weddings, skipped funerals, missed the births of their children. All for this. Now they sat in folding chairs, hands over their faces, staring at static on screens. Elon gathered them, sunken-eyed, voice hoarse. We only have money for one more launch, he told them flatly. No spin, no hype, just truth. If we fail again, SpaceX is done. But if we succeed, everything changes. No one blinked. No one walked out. The stakes had crystallized. It was no longer about ambition. It was about proving that private citizens could touch space. The fourth rocket had to be perfect. There was no funding for second chances. Elon personally took out loans. He sold possessions. He was sleeping in the office, surviving on Red Bull and willpower. Friends begged him to stop. He smiled and asked them if they'd help pack parachutes. The madness somehow became infectious. On September 28, 2008, Falcon 1 rolled out again. The atmosphere on Omelek Island was tense enough to slice with a scalpel. Elon watched in silence. No countdown theatrics. Just breath held hostage. Engines roared. The rocket lifted. Stage 1, success. Stage separation, clean. Stage 2, flawless. Orbital velocity achieved. Cheers erupted like thunder. Engineers wept. Elon didn't collapse or shout. He stood still, nodding. Quiet. The magnitude of it didn't hit him until hours later. That flight was the difference between life and death for SpaceX, he admitted. Bankruptcy had been inches away. That success wasn't just a technical milestone, it was a lifeline. But they'd done it. SpaceX became the first private company to deliver a liquid-fueled rocket into Earth's orbit. The skeptics vanished. The story changed. Elon Musk wasn't just the PayPal guy with comic book dreams anymore. He was the man who had crashed, burned, and risen 3 times before finally touching the stars. The fireballs weren't failures anymore. They were war medals, proof that history doesn't bend to those who fear looking foolish. It bends to those who try, fail, and try again. Those who dare to stare down the impossible until it blinks first. And in that moment, the gamble wasn't a gamble. It was destiny, with engine smoke on its heels and the stars dead ahead. Each failed launch was a gut punch. Not just a technical hiccup or a bad day at the office, these were emotional implosions. The kind that made grown engineers sink into folding chairs and bury their faces in trembling hands. For Elon, every failure was a personal bruise, and with each one, the line between ambition and insanity blurred a little more. He wasn't just burning through fuel. He was burning through trust, investors, engineers, and sometimes his own. After the first failure, Elon didn't rage. He didn't curse the skies or find a scapegoat. Instead, he stared into the monitor's static and whispered, "What did we miss?" It was a question, yes, but it was also a shield, a way to guard against despair by focusing on the problem, not the pain. And the team followed him, not because he was always right, but because he always returned. Day after day, launch after launch, with the same urgency in his voice and the same fire in his eyes. But behind that fire was a very real fear. Elon wasn't a machine. He was a man running on caffeine, adrenaline, and sheer defiance. He barely slept. He snapped at colleagues, then apologized. He paced. He stared blankly at spreadsheets and simulated trajectories. He bit his nails. There was even a time, after a particularly brutal failure, when someone found him in the corner of the engineering bay, eyes red, whispering calculations to himself like a prayer. He later admitted, without dramatics, that he had cried. Alone, quietly, not because the rocket failed, but because of what it meant. Each explosion wasn't just a fiery display. It was a declaration that dreams, especially the big ones, demand blood. And if you want to build a ladder to the stars, sometimes you have to crawl through the ashes. The world didn't see that side. They saw the headlines. SpaceX fails again. Another crash for the billionaire's vanity project. Elon's face became a punchline. Memes of exploding rockets replaced faith in his mission. Venture capitalists ghosted him. Government officials rolled their eyes. And still, he returned to the hangar. To the press, he issued one line that would later be immortalized in business books and inspirational posters. Failure is an option here. If things are not failing, you are not innovating. But that quote, like most, lost its weight without the context, the nights he couldn't sleep. The engineers he had to console. The sinking fear that maybe, just maybe, the critics were right. One of the hardest moments came after the third failure. Not just because the rocket exploded midair, though that certainly didn't help, but because Elon had started to believe in a streak. There was a palpable sense, even among skeptics, that the third time would be the charm. The rocket cleared the pad. The air was electric. Then a fuel line anomaly, a collision, a fireball, and silence. Elon didn't speak for a full minute after the explosion. He just stared. Then he turned, walked to his team, and delivered what would later be known as the reckoning speech. We have one launch left. That's it. One rocket. One shot. If it works, we live. If not, we're done. There was no anger in his voice. Just truth. Brutal, unfiltered truth. The kind that strips away pretense and forces people to decide what they really believe in. That night, Elon didn't go home. He didn't shower. He scribbled notes on napkins. He diagrammed improvements in the margins of old flight logs. He called engineers at 3 a.m. with ideas, questions, half-formed revelations. He didn't care if they were asleep. He needed to move, to push, to prove to himself, most of all, that this dream was still worth it. There was a point when even his most loyal friends suggested he step back, that he had done enough, that it was okay to walk away. Elon smiled, thanked them, and asked if they had time to test engine valves. Because underneath the exhaustion, the fear, and the ridicule, there was still belief. That fragile, flickering flame that said, "Try one more time." And that's what they did. Over the following days, the SpaceX team worked like their lives depended on it. In a way, they did. Elon sold everything he could. He went from being one of the wealthiest entrepreneurs in the world to borrowing money for rent. The line between sacrifice and desperation blurred. Vendors stopped answering calls. Engineers had to salvage parts. Everyone felt the weight of finality. But within that pressure, something shifted. It was as if the team, staring down the barrel of defeat, finally found their sharpest edge. Simulations tightened. Test runs became obsessive. No detail was too small. No redundancy too redundant. Every screw, every weld, every calculation had the echo of finality behind it. And Elon, though stretched thin, became a source of relentless energy. No one believed in the mission more fiercely. He began spending entire nights at the hangar again, not out of necessity, but because he couldn't bear to leave. He feared that the moment he stepped away, the fragile dream might dissolve. This wasn't just about a rocket anymore. It was about what a small team of outcasts, dreamers, and misfits could do when the world said, enough. One more chance, one more launch, one last spark of hope. Each failed launch was a gut punch. Not just a technical hiccup or a bad day at the office, these were emotional implosions. The kind that made grown engineers sink into folding chairs and bury their faces in trembling hands. For Elon, every failure was a personal bruise, and with each one, the line between ambition and insanity blurred a little more. He wasn't just burning through fuel. He was burning through trust, investors, engineers, and sometimes his own. After the first failure, Elon didn't rage. He didn't curse the skies or find a scapegoat. Instead, he stared into the monitor's static and whispered, "What did we miss?" It was a question, yes, but it was also a shield, a way to guard against despair by focusing on the problem, not the pain. And the team followed him, not because he was always right, but because he always returned. Day after day, launch after launch, with the same urgency in his voice and the same fire in his eyes. But behind that fire was a very real fear. Elon wasn't a machine. He was a man running on caffeine, adrenaline, and sheer defiance. He barely slept. He snapped at colleagues, then apologized. He paced. He stared blankly at spreadsheets and simulated trajectories. He bit his nails. There was even a time, after a particularly brutal failure, when someone found him in the corner of the engineering bay, eyes red, whispering calculations to himself like a prayer. He later admitted, without dramatics, that he had cried. Alone, quietly, not because the rocket failed, but because of what it meant. Each explosion wasn't just a fiery display. It was a declaration that dreams, especially the big ones, demand blood. And if you want to build a ladder to the stars, sometimes you have to crawl through the ashes. The world didn't see that side. They saw the headlines. SpaceX fails again. Another crash for the billionaire's vanity project. Elon's face became a punchline. Memes of exploding rockets replaced faith in his mission. Venture capitalists ghosted him. Government officials rolled their eyes. And still, he returned to the hangar. To the press, he issued one line that would later be immortalized in business books and inspirational posters. Failure is an option here. If things are not failing, you are not innovating. But that quote, like most, lost its weight without the context, the nights he couldn't sleep. The engineers he had to console. The sinking fear that maybe, just maybe, the critics were right. One of the hardest moments came after the third failure. Not just because the rocket exploded mid-air, though that certainly didn't help, but because Elon had started to believe in a streak. There was a palpable sense, even among skeptics, that the third time would be the charm. The rocket cleared the pad. The air was electric. Then a fuel line anomaly, a collision, a fireball, and silence. Elon didn't speak for a full minute after the explosion. He just stared. Then he turned, walked to his team, and delivered what would later be known as the reckoning speech. We have one launch left. That's it. One rocket. One shot. If it works, we live. If not, we're done. There was no anger in his voice. Just truth. Brutal, unfiltered truth. The kind that strips away pretense and forces people to decide what they really believe in. That night, Elon didn't go home. He didn't shower. He scribbled notes on napkins. He diagrammed improvements in the margins of old flight logs. He called engineers at 3 a.m. with ideas, questions, half-formed revelations. He didn't care if they were asleep. He needed to move, to push, to prove to himself, most of all, that this dream was still worth it. There was a point when even his most loyal friends suggested he step back, that he had done enough, that it was okay to walk away. Elon smiled, thanked them, and asked if they had time to test engine valves. Because underneath the exhaustion, the fear, and the ridicule, there was still belief. That fragile, flickering flame that said, "Try one more time." And that's what they did. Over the following days, the SpaceX team worked like their lives depended on it. In a way, they did. Elon sold everything he could. He went from being one of the wealthiest entrepreneurs in the world to borrowing money for rent. The line between sacrifice and desperation blurred. Vendors stopped answering calls. Engineers had to salvage parts. Everyone felt the weight of finality. But within that pressure, something shifted. It was as if the team, staring down the barrel of defeat, finally found their sharpest edge. Simulations tightened. Test runs became obsessive. No detail was too small. No redundancy too redundant. Every screw, every weld, every calculation had the echo of finality behind it. And Elon, though stretched thin, became a source of relentless energy. No one believed in the mission more fiercely. He began spending entire nights at the hangar again, not out of necessity, but because he couldn't bear to leave. He feared that the moment he stepped away, the fragile dream might dissolve. This wasn't just about a rocket anymore. It was about what a small team of outcasts, dreamers, and misfits could do when the world said, enough. One more chance, one more launch, one last spark of hope. And through it all, Elon found strange moments of levity. In a moment of punch-drunk delirium, he joked about starting a line of space-themed donuts if the fourth launch failed. Galactic Glaze, he called it. It made the team laugh. They needed that laugh, because humor, after all, was free. And sometimes it was the only thing keeping gravity from winning. The fourth launch wasn't just a launch, it was a lifeline. The final thread holding together a dream that had frayed under the strain of 3 public, humiliating failures. By now, Elon Musk wasn't just fighting for SpaceX. He was fighting for Tesla, for Solar City, for every sleepless night spent chasing a future most people couldn't see. The money was nearly gone. His credibility was shredded. The press had their knives out, ready to carve the post-mortem of his ambition. And still, he showed up. Falcon 1 Flight 4 became the make-or-break moment. If this rocket exploded, the dream exploded with it. Elon had poured nearly all his PayPal fortune into his trio of companies. SpaceX alone had eaten $100 million. Add $70 million to Tesla, and another $10 million into Solar City, and there wasn't much left except stock options and nerve. He mortgaged those too. At one point, he borrowed money to cover rent. Yes, Elon Musk, the supposed billionaire, couch-surfed and cut costs like a college student clinging to ramen noodles and faith. When people told him to quit, he nodded politely, then asked if they had a contact for surplus thruster valves. Internally, he was anything but calm. Friends noticed it in the way he moved, tighter, more abrupt. His jokes became sharper, tinged with exhaustion. He still smiled, still made references to sci-fi, but his eyes told the truth. He was terrified, not just of failure, but what that failure would say to every kid who dared to dream audaciously, to every young engineer who believed the impossible was just engineering with more caffeine. He couldn't let them down, but dreams cost fuel, and SpaceX was running on fumes. To get this last rocket built and launched, the team became part machinist, part miracle worker. They scavenged parts, negotiated with skeptical vendors, slept in the hangar. At one point, an engineer welded a section of the rocket using a modified bracket from a construction crane. The level of improvisation wasn't just scrappy, it was borderline spiritual. They were no longer just engineers. They were believers on a mission to resurrect hope from the ashes of failure. And Elon, he was everywhere. He attended every systems test. He proofread code. He manually reviewed telemetry sequences at 3 a.m. When sensor tests shorted out, he got down on the floor with a flashlight and soldering gun. Not because he had to, but because he could not. This wasn't about ego anymore. It was about survival. And maybe something more, a deep, aching need to prove that vision, when paired with relentless grit, could actually defy gravity. In private, he prepared for both outcomes. If it failed, he had already instructed legal teams to shutter operations gracefully. He wrote goodbye letters to staff, drafted press releases, but he never showed it publicly. Instead, he rallied the troops. "I believe in you," he told the engineers the night before the launch. "And I believe in this rocket. Whatever happens, we've done something extraordinary." And then, with his classic half grin, he added, "Let's light this candle." Launch day arrived on September 28, 2008. Kwajalein Atoll, a tiny military outpost in the Marshall Islands, halfway between nowhere and oblivion. The Falcon 1 stood tall on the launch pad, its white body gleaming against a cobalt sky. Around it, the wind was calm, the sky deceptively clear, as if the universe itself had paused to watch what would happen next. Inside the command trailer, the SpaceX team was silent, their eyes fixed on monitors. Elon stood in the back, arms crossed tightly over his chest. No jokes now, just breath-holding anticipation. Countdown. Systems check. Final telemetry lock. 10 seconds. 9, 8. His heartbeat louder than the voice over the speaker. 7, 6. A quick prayer, maybe from someone in the back, maybe from Elon himself. 5, 4, 3. Ignition. The engines roared to life, flames blooming beneath the rocket like a dragon exhaling. For a moment, everyone braced for the worst. They'd seen this picture before, hope followed by horror. But not this time. Falcon 1 lifted off. Smooth, controlled, beautiful. Cheers erupted, and then quiet again. Because SpaceX knew better than to celebrate too early. The previous failures had taught them to be cautious. The rocket cleared Max Q, the point of maximum aerodynamic stress. It staged successfully. It entered orbit. Orbit, a word so simple, yet so monumentally difficult to achieve. Inside the trailer, disbelief turned to tears. Elation, laughter that cracked through tension like sunlight breaking cloud cover. Elon didn't scream. He didn't jump. He just dropped his head into his hands and breathed for the first time in weeks. Then slowly he smiled. Falcon 1 had done it. The first privately developed liquid-fueled rocket to reach orbit. No government, no backup plan, just a band of sleep-deprived dreamers and a man who refused to quit. That flight changed everything. NASA called. Investors reappeared. Tesla got breathing room. Solar City gained credibility. But more than that, Elon proved that failure wasn't fatal. That with enough grit, belief, and just the right amount of stubbornness, even the biggest risks could lead to history. Later, someone asked him what kept him going when everything fell apart. Elon didn't give a TED Talk answer. He didn't quote a philosopher. He just shrugged and said, "I figured if we were going to fail, we might as well fail doing something that mattered." And then he laughed, because humor, after all, is still free. September 28, 2008. Kwajalein Atoll, a remote stretch of coral reef and concrete hidden deep in the Pacific Ocean, became the crucible where hope and desperation collided. The morning had started like all others, humid, quiet, heavy with the scent of salt and anticipation. But by dusk, it would be remembered as the birthplace of something extraordinary. Inside the makeshift mission control, a low, nondescript bunker lined with frayed cables and folding tables, the SpaceX team moved like ghosts. No banter, no bravado, just the soft clatter of keyboards, the static of radio chatter, and the near imperceptible hum of adrenaline. Elon Musk stood at the back of the room, apart from the crowd, but tethered to every movement on screen. His face was a portrait of exhaustion, pale, hollow-cheeked, and shadowed by 3 sleepless nights. He hadn't changed his clothes in over a day. A wrinkled white t-shirt clung to his frame under a lightweight black jacket. His hands were jammed into his pockets, fists clenched so tightly his knuckles had turned white. He didn't speak. He didn't blink. He just stared at the monitor. Falcon 1, their last rocket, sat poised on the launch pad like a silver arrow, silent and still against a backdrop of orange dusk. The countdown echoed through the room, each number carving another slice from Elon's nerves. T-minus 10, 9, 8. Someone whispered a prayer. Someone else muttered a checklist. Elon said nothing. At 0, the engines ignited with a roar that seemed to pull every breath from the room. The rocket lifted, slowly at first, trembling, wobbling, then climbing with growing confidence, cutting through the pastel sky like a blade. For first 10 seconds, no one breathed. Then 20, 30. The dreaded point of previous failures approached. Elon's eyes widened. The telemetry held steady. Altitude increased. Velocity on track. Stage separation nominal. A voice crackled through the speaker. Cheers started to bubble up, quickly silenced by a collective shoo. No one wanted to jinx it. Every sensor reading was a lifeline. Every second in the air, a tiny miracle. Then came the call. Falcon 1 has achieved orbit. Repeat, orbit confirmed. The room erupted. Chaos and joy. Engineers who hadn't smiled in weeks embraced, shouted, sobbed. One collapsed into a chair and covered their face with shaking hands. Another fist pumped so hard they knocked over a monitor. The noise was deafening, but Elon heard none of it. He turned, almost in a trance, and walked out. Outside, the tropical air wrapped around him like a warm towel. The sky was a fading watercolor of stars and clouds. Elon leaned against the nearest concrete wall, bracing himself as though gravity had doubled. His chest rose and fell in sharp, uneven gasps. Then, finally, the dam broke. He cried, not the silent, stoic tears of frustration, but a messy, raw outpouring of relief. His shoulders shook. His hands trembled. The weight of 4 impossible years crashed down at once. The ridicule, the sleepless nights, the doubts, the bankrupt accounts, the vaporized rockets, all of it found its way out through salt and breath. Alone in the twilight, he wept like a man who had come back from the edge. It wasn't just a win. It was salvation. Back inside, the celebration raged on. Some team members had already begun calling loved ones. Others were cracking open beers they'd stashed for just this occasion. Someone played Queen's "We Are the Champions" on a tinny Bluetooth speaker, and for the first time in years, it didn't feel ironic. But Elon stayed outside for a long time. He stared at the stars, blinking through tears, wondering what his mother might say, what his kids would think when they were old enough to understand. For years, he had carried the weight of disbelief, other people's and his own. And now, against every odd, SpaceX had become the first private company in history to put a liquid-fueled rocket into orbit. A ripple of history, made not by governments or agencies, but by a ragtag crew with just enough brains, sweat, and stubbornness to make the impossible real. Eventually, Elon returned to the mission control, his face blotchy but calm. The team fell silent when they saw him. For a moment, they thought he might give a speech, something grand, worthy of the occasion. Instead, he simply looked around the room, nodded once, and said, "We're not done yet." It was pure Elon. Victory was a pause, not a finish line, because the goal had never been just to launch a rocket. The goal was Mars. And if this moment proved anything, it was that maybe, just maybe, that goal wasn't as insane as the world once thought. Later, when asked what that moment meant to him, Elon would struggle to describe it. Words, after all, rarely do justice to survival. But those who were there that night knew. They knew because they had seen the impossible bend. Not just the rocket, but the belief that something better was always just one more try away. And on a remote island in the middle of the Pacific, the future had just taken flight. That single successful launch on September 28, 2008, didn't just lift a rocket, it resurrected a dream. Within mere weeks, NASA took notice in the most tangible way possible, a $1.6 billion contract for 12 resupply missions to the International Space Station. Billion with a B. It was the kind of number that turns whispers into headlines, skeptics into believers, and bankrupt startups into aerospace contenders. For SpaceX, this was the financial lifeline they desperately needed. For Elon Musk, it was validation after years of being called a reckless outsider, a Silicon Valley eccentric meddling in aerospace. News of the contract hit like a shockwave. Financial media scrambled to revise their coverage. Overnight, the narrative shifted. The same headlines that once branded him, the man who burns millions on failed rockets, now hailed him as a visionary poised to revolutionize spaceflight. CNBC featured him on back-to-back segments. Tech blogs that mocked his ambitions suddenly quoted him with reverence. Investors who had ghosted his calls months before began circling back with eagerness, hoping to squeeze onto the rocket they had once abandoned. Inside SpaceX, morale flipped like a switch. The air in the office, once thick with tension and doubt, now hummed with renewed purpose. Engineers worked longer hours, but this time with energy fueled by pride instead of desperation. Whiteboards filled with fresh concepts. Labs that had echoed with silence now buzzed with rapid-fire discussion. New resumes arrived daily, from graduates to veterans, all drawn by the spark that SpaceX had reignited. And yet, through all the noise, Elon remained strangely grounded. Not mellow, not calm, just grounded. He still paced the floor during engine tests. He still challenged assumptions in design reviews. But there was a shift in his energy, less frantic, more focused. He no longer had to fight to be taken seriously. That battle was won. Now it was time to deliver. He gave very few interviews in those weeks following the NASA deal, but one quote stood out when asked how it felt to go from a punchline to a government contractor. He said simply, "You only look crazy until it works." Privately, Elon knew better than to let victory dull his edge. The contract was a milestone, yes, but not a destination. NASA's vote of confidence didn't mean the road ahead would be smooth. Rockets still exploded, deadlines still loomed, and there were still skeptics, plenty of them, waiting for the next misstep. Still, the transformation in perception was undeniable. Where once Elon had been seen as an interloper, an overfunded dilettante playing with fire, now he was being whispered about in the same breath as aerospace legends. And that whisper grew louder with every milestone SpaceX hit. With each successful test, the mythos around him expanded. Employees at SpaceX would later recall how Elon treated the NASA deal not as a finish line, but as a lease extension. He told them, "This gives us breathing room. It does not mean we've arrived. Don't mistake oxygen for a summit." It was classic Elon, philosophical, a little cryptic, and entirely focused on the long game. Meanwhile, at Tesla and SolarCity, the effect rippled outward. Investors saw that Elon was no longer just the guy with big ideas, he was the guy who could actually pull them off. Funding rounds closed faster. Partnerships that had stalled were suddenly back on the table. Even competitors took notice. Boeing issued a carefully worded statement about welcoming innovation in the commercial space sector. Translation: SpaceX was now on their radar. But beyond the media spin and market dynamics, something subtler had shifted: belief. Not just public belief, but internal belief, the kind that matters when your job is welding a rocket fuselage in a dusty warehouse or writing code for guidance systems that can't afford to fail. People began to believe that, under Elon's maddening expectations and relentless push, they were building something historic. And Elon, he was still riding that razor's edge between brilliance and burnout. He was still sleeping under his desk some nights, still obsessing over valve designs and thruster alignments. But now, the difference was clear. He wasn't just dragging people up the mountain. They were climbing with him. The media continued to toggle between calling him a genius and a gambler, often in the same article. But maybe Elon thought they were finally starting to understand genius and recklessness aren't opposites. They often ride in the same seat. One hand on the wheel, the other on the eject lever. And maybe that's exactly what it takes to change the world. Because behind the money, the headlines, and the tech, that's what it had always been about for Elon, making the impossible just barely possible. And if anyone needed a reminder that the line between collapse and triumph is often just one breath wide, that September day had sealed it. What SpaceX had pulled off was not a lucky break. It was the product of relentless belief, sleepless nights, and an unshakable refusal to quit. The $1.6 billion was more than capital. It was trust. It was the world saying, "We see what you're trying to do. Keep going." That was all Elon ever needed. Elon Musk didn't wake up the morning after SpaceX's historic fourth flight with a hangover of champagne or the calm glow of victory. He woke up the way he had for years, tired. Not from lack of sleep, though he hadn't had much, but from the relentless gears turning in his head. The Falcon 1 launch had succeeded, yes, but in Elon's mind, that was already old news. He hadn't built SpaceX to fly one rocket. He wanted Mars. and Mars was still millions of miles and dollars away. That morning, he walked into SpaceX headquarters just after sunrise wearing the same faded black t-shirt and jeans from the day before. The office was still buzzing with afterglow, engineers high-fiving, team leads holding impromptu debriefs with the kind of enthusiasm you only see after a miracle. But Elon didn't stop to soak it in. He bypassed the break room celebration, the bagels someone had brought in, the congratulatory posters someone had taped to the glass walls. He beelined for the Dragon capsule mock-up and began inspecting the thruster mountings with the intensity of a man who didn't just want to succeed, he needed to. When an engineer passed by with a smile and a "great job, Elon," he barely nodded. Not out of arrogance, but focus. Elon wasn't rude. He was consumed. He spent the next 12 hours in back-to-back technical meetings, poring over every subsystem of the upcoming Falcon 9. He asked questions, dozens of them, about helium pressurization, avionics redundancies, and failure tolerances. Some meetings lasted 2 hours, longer than scheduled. Some employees had to reschedule their family dinners. No one complained. They'd just seen what he was capable of pulling off. Now they were beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, he really could take them further. But beneath the optimism, a different current ran through Elon, a quiet anxiety he never talked about. Success hadn't calmed him, it had intensified the stakes. He remembered too clearly what failure felt like, the silence in the control room after the third crash, the email from a supplier saying they could no longer do business with SpaceX, the tears he cried alone in his office, wondering if he just wasted his life chasing a fantasy. Those memories weren't gone. They were seared into him. That's why he started sleeping on the floor of the factory again, rolled up in a sleeping bag between shifts, surrounded by machine parts and circuit boards. Not because he had to, but because he couldn't bear the thought of distance between himself and the mission. If something breaks at 3 a.m., I want to be 5 feet away from it, he said to an engineer once. And he meant it. His days stretched into nights. 80-hour work weeks became standard. Weekends blurred into weekdays. And the emails, oh, the emails. His staff got used to receiving messages with subject lines like "valve tolerance concern, need answer at 2:47 a.m." or "Dragon parachute tests, why only 3 deployments at 5:13 a.m." He wasn't micromanaging, not exactly. He was leading with obsession. He believed that greatness was forged in the details. And the only way to get the details right was to live in them. Some people thrived under that intensity. Others burned out. Turnover at SpaceX was high, and not just because of the long hours. It was the pressure of working for a man who wanted to colonize another planet while you were still trying to get the wiring to stop short-circuiting. Elon didn't apologize for it. "I'm not looking for people who want a job," he told new hires. "I'm looking for people who want a mission." And the mission kept growing. Now that Falcon 1 had proven viable, Falcon 9 was next, a 2-stage rocket capable of carrying heavier payloads into orbit. Then came Dragon, the capsule that could transport cargo and eventually humans to the International Space Station. Elon talked about reusability, about lowering launch costs by a factor of 10, about multiplanetary life and terraforming Mars. Some of the engineers rolled their eyes in private. Others wrote his words on whiteboards like gospel. At Tesla, too, things were accelerating. He wasn't just juggling companies, he was juggling revolutions. Clean energy, electric cars, and commercial space travel. And he was doing it with every cent he had. The NASA contract gave SpaceX breathing room, but Elon didn't use that room to relax. He used it to double down. By the end of that year, he was thinner, paler, and even more intense. Friends worried about him. Some staged gentle interventions, inviting him to vacations, dinners, movies. He declined almost all of them. "The stakes are too high," he said. "There's no fallback plan for humanity." That's the part most people didn't see. Elon wasn't chasing money. He already had it. He wasn't chasing fame. He had that, too, though he never cared for it. He was chasing legacy. The idea that one person could bend the arc of civilization, even slightly, toward something better. And that belief, delusional or visionary, depending on who you asked, was what kept him going when every sane person would have stopped. He told a friend once, half joking but not really, complacency is the real enemy. Comfort kills ambition. That's why, after the biggest win of his life, he didn't go to Disneyland or pop a bottle of Dom. He pulled out a new whiteboard marker and wrote Falcon 9 Timeline on a wall that still smelled like solder and ambition. Because in Elon's world, there were no finish lines, just launch pads. The stress took a toll, not just figuratively, but in visible, measurable, undeniable ways. Elon Musk, once the young Silicon Valley phenom with tousled hair and a mischievous glint in his eye, began to look older than his years. His face grew leaner, his eyes more shadowed, his expressions less boyish and more battle-worn. Gone was the brash dot-com millionaire image. In its place stood a man who bore the weight of 3 industries on his back and looked like he hadn't slept in years. Because, in truth, he hadn't. The cost wasn't confined to the lines on his face. Elon's first marriage to Justine Wilson dissolved in the middle of it all. It wasn't the sudden kind of ending, no scandal, no tabloids, just a slow unraveling under the strain of too many obligations and too little time. They had been partners, dreamers together in the early days, raising a family, while Elon chased visions of a different future. But visions, no matter how noble, can be cruel companions. They demand everything, and Elon gave them everything. He tried to be present, to show up for his 5 sons between factory visits and late-night code reviews. But there are only so many hours in a day, and Elon used most of them trying to save the future, which meant he was often absent from present. Friends began to notice a shift. The man who once cracked irreverent jokes at every turn started speaking more in sighs than sentences. They said he looked haunted, like someone who'd seen something on the other side of a door and couldn't unsee it. At meetings, he'd drift into long silences, staring at white boards like they were confessionals. Staff began whispering about his long walks through the Tesla factory, how he'd inspect bolts and paint finishes with a near-obsessive intensity, all while wearing a blank, unreadable face. During one interview, when a journalist asked if building companies like SpaceX and Tesla was fun, Elon chuckled, then paused. "I feel a great deal of emotional pain," he admitted, not flinching. "It's not like I'm having a lot of fun. I don't have a choice." The words sounded almost mechanical, but the eyes behind them told a real story, red-rimmed, fatigued, and heavy with something deeper than mere overwork. He didn't say it for sympathy. He said it because it was true. The pressure was immense, not only from the public, but from within. Elon held himself to standards most wouldn't dare imagine. Good enough was never good enough. If a weld wasn't perfect, if a delivery was delayed, if a design felt 1% inefficient, he noticed, and he cared. Deeply, sometimes too deeply. His relentless pursuit of perfection became a kind of self-imposed torment. One Tesla executive later said working with Elon felt like being strapped to a SpaceX rocket. You might reach orbit, or you might explode. Yet Elon didn't view the pain as a deterrent. He saw it as the dues one paid to change the world. He often quoted a line from his own brain, "If you're not hurting, you're not pushing hard enough." It was part masochism, part philosophy. He believed that true innovation, the kind that rewired civilization, required suffering, not for the sake of it, but as an unavoidable byproduct of doing something no one else dared. And he wasn't wrong about the toll. There were days when his body rebelled. He'd fall asleep on the floor of the factory, still in his clothes, a wrench in one hand and a phone in the other. He'd miss meals for entire days, subsisting on Diet Coke and protein bars. During a particularly brutal week, in 2010, he worked 120 hours, 17 hours a day, every day, and refused to leave the Tesla floor until the final Model S had rolled out and passed inspection. "If I don't sleep in the factory, the team will think I don't care," he told an assistant. "But I do, more than they know." In private, Elon was more vulnerable than anyone expected. He admitted to his closest friends and even in scattered interviews that he had cried, yes, cried, after failed launches, blown deadlines, and nights when the weight of it all felt too much. "I'd rather stick a fork in my hand than go through that again," he once told a colleague after a brutal investor meeting. He wasn't being dramatic. He meant it. Still, he stayed, even when he probably shouldn't have, even when his body and mind were telling him to quit. Because in Elon's mind, pain was part of the contract. If it didn't hurt, it wasn't meaningful. If it was easy, it wasn't worth doing. If I walked away, he said in a rare moment of introspection, what does that say to everyone else who believed? What happens to the people who trusted me with their jobs, their time, their hope? That more than ambition or ego was what kept him going. The unbearable idea that if he stopped, everything would collapse. And not just the companies, but the possibility that they represented. There's a particular cruelty in building things for the future. You don't get to live in the world you're trying to create. You're always stuck in the gap between what is and what could be. And that gap is full of doubt, criticism, and exhaustion. Elon knew that better than anyone, but he stood in it anyway. He didn't pretend to be invincible. He just acted like quitting was impossible. And maybe that's what made him dangerous, not to others, but to the limits of possibility. He was willing to suffer, publicly and privately, for a dream few people even understood. It wasn't healthy. It wasn't balanced. It probably wasn't sustainable. But it was undeniably brave. And in the quiet moments, the rare flashes when the emails paused and the factory lights dimmed, Elon would sit alone and wonder if it was all worth it. Not for his legacy, not for his bank account, but for the slim chance that his suffering might pave the road for someone else to walk a little easier. In the end, Elon didn't suffer because he loved pain. He suffered because he believed the future was worth bleeding for. And through every crack in his armor, through every line on his face, that belief burned brighter than ever. Despite everything, the personal breakdowns, the financial chaos, the failed launches that had turned his dreams to smoke and fragments, humor, somehow, kept sneaking in. Elon Musk, battered by setbacks and ghost white from stress, still found the mental bandwidth to crack a joke. It wasn't deflection. It wasn't a PR move. It was his survival mechanism, a kind of pressure valve that let the madness hiss out before it exploded. He didn't use humor to deny the stakes. He used it to face them. When Falcon 9 finally soared into the sky and returned its booster in one piece, something that sounded like science fiction just a few years prior, Elon didn't release a self-congratulatory press release or pop champagne in front of news cameras. Instead, he took to Twitter and wrote, "Rocket booster landing, confirmed, not a pile of smoking debris." That was it. 10 words. Technical brilliance distilled into self-deprecating comedy. And it worked. The internet loved it. The aerospace world raised eyebrows. And Elon, he just smirked and moved on to the next problem. He wasn't trying to be funny. He was being honest, in the most absurd way possible. The idea that rockets could land on drone ships in the middle of the ocean was, to most people, laughable in itself. Elon just beat everyone to the punchline. But that blend of absurdity and audacity, that's what made him uniquely Elon. While CEOs were prepping statements for shareholders, Elon was sending out memes. While engineers debated the weight ratio of fuel tanks, Elon was naming spacecraft, "Of course, I still love you," after a sci-fi novel. While PR consultants warned against distractions, Elon was launching a red Tesla Roadster into deep space, playing David Bowie's Starman on repeat, and placing a message on the dashboard that read, "Don't panic." A nod to the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, of course. The whole thing was ridiculous, but also it was brilliant. That launch wasn't just a flex. It was theater. It was symbolism. It was Elon saying, "We're not just sending up metal, we're sending up dreams." And who could argue? The images of the cherry red Tesla with the Earth reseeding in the background went viral in minutes. It looked like CGI. People couldn't believe it was real. But it was. It was real, and it was ridiculous, and it was real again. That was the magic. Behind the scenes, the SpaceX team was exhausted but electrified. Engineers who had once burned out under the crushing weight of failure now felt like they were working in the future. The mood in the company shifted, not just because they were winning, but because they were winning with flair. Falcon Heavy hadn't just succeeded, it had captured the world's imagination. Elon had found a tone that resonated, humor without mockery, Vision without ego. Confidence without cruelty. He didn't punch down. He punched gravity. Even his employees, who bore the brunt of his legendary perfectionism, began to internalize that duality. Work harder, yes. Work smarter, absolutely. But never lose the spark of why it mattered. One SpaceX technician once said he'll send you a 2 a.m. email asking why a SEAL failed thermal testing and then include a meme of a penguin in a lab coat. That's Elon. In many ways, Elon's humor made the impossible feel less intimidating. He didn't pretend to have all the answers. He made it clear that failure was part of the ride. And if failure was going to happen, they might as well laugh when they could. One of the internal Slack channels at SpaceX was literally titled Rapid Unscheduled Disassembly, the team's tongue-in-cheek term for rocket explosions. This humor wasn't just for SpaceX insiders. It reached the public too. People who had never cared about launch trajectories or propellant efficiency started following rocket news. Kids who might have once dreamed of being astronauts now dreamed of being engineers. Space was cool again, and Elon was part of the reason why. But it would be a mistake to think the jokes meant he wasn't serious. Elon's humor coexisted with his intensity. It didn't dilute the work, it made the burden bearable. And that made all the difference. He once said in an interview, "I think it's important to have a future that feels like it's worth getting up for in the morning. Not just a future filled with data, but one filled with stories. One that can make people smile, or laugh, or stare into the sky with wonder again." It was in that spirit that SpaceX became something more than a private company. It became a symbol of risk, of resilience, of relentless pursuit, and of irreverent optimism. It was the rarest kind of revolution, one with jokes. Not everyone approved. Critics called him childish, reckless, a distraction. They said the memes made him unserious. But the results spoke louder than the criticism. SpaceX was landing rockets, reducing costs, making NASA lean in, building hardware that worked and stories that stuck. And through it all, Elon never lost that twinkle in his eye. That impulse to slip humor into even the most high-stakes moment. Not because he didn't care, but because he cared so much that he had to find a way to breathe. In the end, it wasn't the jokes that made the journey historic, but they made it human. They made it something people could connect with, not just admire from afar. And maybe that was the real key. Not just flying higher, but bringing people along for the ride. As one Falcon 9 technician put it, "We don't just build rockets here. We build punchlines for the stars." And somehow, impossibly, Elon Musk made it all feel like it belonged together. Public perception didn't just shift, it transformed like a rocket shedding its booster stage mid-flight. Elon Musk, once mocked as a cash-burning eccentric with delusions of Martian grandeur, suddenly became something far more complicated. He wasn't merely rich or brilliant or daring. He was the guy who had actually done it. Against the odds, despite the critics, and through the rubble of multiple fiery failures, he had lifted his dream off the launch pad and into orbit. For the first time, a private company had done what only governments had achieved before. And the world took notice. News anchors no longer smirked when saying his name. Industry insiders stopped calling him a dilettante and began calling him a disruptor. Tech panels that once omitted him from discussions about serious innovation began using SpaceX as a case study in possibility. Suddenly, Elon Musk was no longer just a guy with crazy ideas. He was the guy who actually did the crazy thing and made it work. For many, it was like watching fiction bleed into reality. He didn't just fund a rocket company. He proved you didn't need a nation-state to reach the stars. You needed something rarer, a blend of raw intelligence, engineering obsession, unwavering conviction, and an appetite for risk that bordered on the masochistic. It wasn't just the rockets that drew people in. It was the resilience, the story, the fact that this man had been on the brink of bankruptcy, had cried behind closed doors, had been ridiculed, and still showed up. That part hit people, because maybe they weren't engineers. Maybe they didn't understand orbital mechanics. But they knew failure, they knew doubt, and they knew what it felt like to be underestimated. Elon became a symbol, not a perfect one, not even a universally beloved one, but undeniably a symbol of sheer will. Some saw him as a genius, others as a reckless cowboy, but nobody could ignore him anymore. And through the noise, one thing was constant: he kept showing up. At launch rehearsals, at design reviews, at late-night emergency meetings with engineers. He didn't vanish when things went wrong. He leaned in, sometimes too hard, but always in. Internally at SpaceX, the change in how the world viewed Elon added both pressure and pride. Engineers who once questioned the future of their jobs now proudly wore SpaceX badges. Interns stopped seeing the company as a resume builder and started seeing it as a mission. It wasn't uncommon to overhear someone in the control room say, "I left NASA to be here. I left Boeing. I left Lockheed." Why? Because Elon Musk made them believe they could do something historic. That belief trickled down to everything. From janitors sweeping the floor of the hangar to coders writing safety protocols for launch systems. Every small task became part of a greater vision. Elon had a way of making people see their individual contribution as part of a grand, almost mythic story. The story of how a group of outsiders, misfits, and believers took on an industry ruled by giants and didn't just survive, but won. And yet, even with the world watching differently, Elon himself didn't change in the way people expected. He didn't soften. If anything, the pressure intensified his drive. He was still emailing team leads at 3 a.m., still drawing diagrams on whiteboards until the markers ran dry, still agonizing over fuel efficiency formulas and heat shield tolerances. The man simply didn't know how to coast. He was a paradox, relentless and exhausted, brilliant and abrasive, inspiring and infuriating. And in many ways, that made him even more human. People related to his imperfection. He wasn't the polished CEO in a tailored suit giving keynote speeches with manicured talking points. He was the guy who stammered in interviews, who tweeted memes at midnight, who let his emotions show, sometimes too much. He was real. And that, perhaps more than the rockets or the billions, is what made him resonate. Meanwhile, the impact of SpaceX's success began spreading beyond launch pads and investor meetings. Universities updated aerospace curriculums to include case studies on private spaceflight. High school science teachers used Elon's story to motivate students. Look what one person can do. Kids no longer said they wanted to be astronauts. They said they wanted to build rockets. The dream had shifted. Even world governments took notice. The U.S. Air Force signed contracts. European space agencies revisited their models. China accelerated its own programs. Competition, once a Cold War legacy, was now driven by a South African-born entrepreneur with a penchant for risk and Red Bull. The game had changed, but the most powerful shift wasn't institutional. It was psychological. Elon Musk, for all his flaws, had rekindled something that many believe had been lost in the modern era: the audacity to believe in the impossible. He reminded people that failure wasn't fatal, that ridicule wasn't the end, and that dreams, when pursued relentlessly, could become reality. Still, none of it came easily. Elon carried the weight of expectations like heat shielding around a capsule, necessary, but always on the brink of melting under pressure. He knew that one misstep, one failed launch, one public miscalculation could unravel everything. And yet he didn't flinch. He doubled down. When asked by a reporter how he managed to keep going after so many failures, Elon answered with a shrug, "I don't know how to quit." It wasn't bravado. It was truth. Quitting wasn't in his operating system. He was built, for better or worse, to endure, to grind forward, to try again. And that perhaps was the real story. Not the billion-dollar contracts, not the reusable boosters, but the showing up, the stubbornness, the willingness to stand in the ashes of failure and say, "Okay, what now?" Because in the end, that's what separated Elon Musk from most people with big ideas. Not intelligence, not money, but the refusal to let failure define the ending. And through it all, he kept showing up, to work, to dream, to dare. Meanwhile, Falcon rockets launched, landed, and launched again. Reusability wasn't just a science fair concept anymore, it was working. Costs dropped. Reliability soared. Clients from around the world lined up. Satellites, government contracts, private companies, even high school science projects were hitching rides to orbit. SpaceX had gone from punchline to powerhouse. But inside the Hawthorne headquarters, the man who had willed it all into existence paced like a caged animal. Elon Musk was not content. Not yet, because Mars still whispered. It whispered through late-night spreadsheets, through dusty renderings of habitats and regolith-based construction. It whispered in the awkward silences between board meetings and in the back of Elon's mind when he should have been sleeping. Mars wasn't a place. It was a mission, a fixation, a promise he'd made to no one but himself. "I want to die on Mars," he'd said with a smirk during a tech conference, just not on impact. The audience laughed naturally, but Tasha from comms, who knew that Elon rarely joked without a reason, caught something behind his eyes. A quiet terror, not of dying on Mars, of dying before he got there. At SpaceX, Mars was always somewhere on the whiteboards. But after Falcon's growing success, it became the entire board. Elon redirected internal projects to focus on long-term Martian viability. Starship concepts began creeping into slide decks. Raptor engines became dinner conversation. Propellant depots, planetary entry, off-world agriculture, these weren't theoretical anymore. They were bullet points. Employees responded with a mix of awe and exasperation. For new hires, Mars was the sexy part, the big, bold dream they joined SpaceX to chase. For veterans who remembered sleepless nights debugging Falcon avionics, it was a dizzying escalation. "We just made rockets reusable," one engineer muttered in the cafeteria. "Can we please breathe before we terraform a planet?" But Elon didn't breathe. He accelerated. He pushed teams with the same intensity that had defined the early SpaceX days, only now the stakes were extraterrestrial. He scheduled all-hands meetings at 1 a.m. He sent team-wide emails with subject lines like colony thinking. He walked into departments unannounced and asked questions like, "What are we doing today that matters 50 years from now?" The intensity wasn't for everyone. Some engineers burned out. Others adapted. A few thrived. They shared memes. Elon riding a rocket with a Martian flag, Elon as Iron Man, but underneath the jokes was an unshakable sense that they were part of something historic, something absurd, something beautiful. One night, an intern named Miguel stayed late reviewing thermal models for a Mars entry vehicle. Elon wandered by barefoot, holding a Diet Coke and a half-eaten granola bar. "Why are you here so late?" Elon asked. "I want to see Mars," Miguel replied. Elon nodded. "Me too," he said, and kept walking. The media, predictably, danced between ridicule and reverence. The same outlets that had once mocked SpaceX for blowing up expensive fireworks now ran features titled, "Can Elon Musk Save Humanity?" Late-night hosts poked fun at his colonized Mars or bust obsession, but their jokes started sounding more like admiration in disguise. Even NASA grew warmer. Publicly, they praised his efforts. Privately, they studied his breakthroughs. Mars became a brand on mugs, t-shirts, office walls. But to Elon, it was still personal. In rare moments, when asked why Mars, why now, why at all, he'd go quiet. "Because we need a backup plan," he once said in an internal memo. "Because every civilization eventually faces a reckoning. Because staying on Earth forever feels like a slow surrender." But if Mars was a plan B, it was also plan A through Z. Elon's children would inherit a world shaped by climate uncertainty, geopolitical instability, and fragile systems. His legacy, if he had one, wouldn't be cars or tweets or stock prices. It would be a launch pad aimed at another world. He started asking his team, not what could be done, but what must be done. That shift in language echoed across departments. Suddenly, constraints became challenges. Timelines became existential. The impossible became mandatory. SpaceX began running simulations on Martian day-night cycles. Agricultural experiments launched to the ISS. Elon insisted that every hardware decision, no matter how trivial, be considered through the lens of interplanetary survival. Even cafeteria menus changed. Quinoa bowls replaced burgers. "It's the Martian diet," someone joked. Elon didn't laugh. Still, he hadn't lost all humor. When a journalist asked if he really believed humans could live on Mars in his lifetime, Elon replied, "Yes. I just hope I'm not the first one we send." And then added more seriously, "I want to see sunsets in a different sky. That's worth chasing." Back at the factory, the team worked like a colony in waiting. They built not just rockets, but culture. They called themselves Spacians. They wrote songs. They celebrated milestones with Martian-themed cake. One employee got a tattoo of Mars coordinates on his arm. Another wore a red space helmet to work on Halloween. Even the janitorial staff talked about orbit trajectories. But not everything was joy and launch smoke. Elon's expectations were relentless. Some resented his intensity. A few quietly left. But most stayed. Because he stayed. Because he was there always, hair unkempt, eyes rimmed red from lack of sleep, pacing factory floors muttering about payload constraints and orbital windows. Because he never asked more than he gave. And when a prototype Starship exploded on the pad after a particularly hard month, the team winced. Elon watched the footage 3 times in a row. Then he turned, grinned, and said, "At least it landed straight this time before it exploded." The room laughed. They needed that. So did he. Because that was the rhythm now. Fail, learn, rebuild. Push further. He was building not just machines, but momentum. Not just a company, but a movement. One that believed the sky wasn't the limit, it was just step one. And Mars? Still out there. Still whispering. He never forgot those early failures. The footage lives in his mind like well-worn scars, replaying not as trophies but as warnings. Elon still pulls up the old launch videos occasionally, quietly, alone, usually at odd hours when the rest of the world is asleep. The room will be still, a dim glow from a desk lamp casting long shadows across the floor as grainy footage of Falcon 1's first launch flickers on his laptop screen. He watches the ignition, the lift, the slow, uncertain wobble, and then the fall, the fire, the silence. He doesn't flinch, he just stares, jaw clenched, absorbing the full weight of the moment again and again. Not to feel proud, but to remember. Because for Elon, memory isn't nostalgia, it's calibration. Every failure is a compass point, every mistake a lesson etched in smoke and flame. He doesn't let those memories fade because they're the ground beneath his boots. Success can make you soft, he once told a colleague in the Falcon hangar, his voice low and even. "I never want to be soft." The colleague thought he was being dramatic. Elon wasn't. To him, softness was surrender. It meant settling, slowing, forgetting why you started climbing in the first place. So he pushes. He pushes for faster rockets. Rockets that don't just break Earth's grip, but return gracefully, elegantly, like arrows that refuse to stay down. The reusable Falcon 9 wasn't the end goal, it was a training wheel. Now he dreams in stainless steel. Starship, towering and sleek, haunts his whiteboards and napkin sketches. Its profile is etched into his notebooks like a prayer. He wants it to carry life to the moon, to Mars, to places only books dared whisper about before. Faster, heavier, smarter. That's the push. There's no room for coasting, not in a world that still has gravity. He pushes for safer systems. Not because regulators demand it, because he remembers what failure looks like in the eyes of his team. He's seen grown men sob in the sand at Kwajalein, their hands trembling after watching years of work vanish in seconds. He remembers engineers collapsing into chairs, stunned and pale. The way silence descends on a failed launch site like grief. So Elon obsesses over safety margins. He second-guesses redundancies. He drills down into checklists, pokes holes in simulations, demands tests on hardware most executives wouldn't know how to pronounce. Because safety isn't a slogan, it's a promise. And for Elon, a broken promise is unacceptable. He pushes for bigger ideas because to stop now would be a betrayal of everything SpaceX was built to fight against: inertia, apathy, stagnation. Elon doesn't build for comfort. He builds for necessity. He believes humanity's destiny lies among the stars, and anything less is a dangerous compromise. So he pours himself into Starlink, into Mars colonization strategies, into fuel depot logistics and lunar landing simulations. He stays up all night reading papers, arguing with engineers, scribbling formulas with one hand while texting someone at Tesla with the other. His appetite for ambition is unrelenting. He's not trying to build a company, he's trying to rewrite the human story. And through it all, he clings to a single, impossible question. What if we could do more? It's not a rhetorical flourish. It's the fire in his veins. It's what wakes him up before dawn. What drags him back to his desk after midnight. It's the voice that interrupts family dinners, that stares at him from screensavers, that echoes when everyone else has left the building. Elon doesn't just think about the future. He wrestles with it, tears it apart, rebuilds it, and demands that it be better. He walks factory floors with the gait of someone who knows the clock is ticking, not just for product deadlines, but for the planet. Yet he's not blind to the toll. His face has aged more than the years suggest. Lines around his eyes are carved deeper than mere sleep deprivation. His posture, once youthful and boyish, is now hunched from long nights and constant travel. His voice, though still energetic in interviews, carries a weight that wasn't there in the early 2000s. Friends have noticed. Family too. There's a haunted quality to his stare when he's truly lost in thought. Like he's somewhere far away, watching a version of Earth where we never made off the planet. And it terrifies him. That's the thing about Elon most people miss. They see the rockets, the memes, the billionaire antics. They don't see the man up at 3 a.m. replaying failures like lullabies. They don't hear the silence of a man questioning whether it's enough, whether he's done enough, whether it'll all crumble the moment he looks away. He said before that he doesn't fear failure anymore, but the truth is, he fears complacency far more. To Elon, success is a moving target. Hit one milestone, and the next appears just a few miles farther down the runway. The goalpost isn't Mars. It's beyond. It's about making sure that when this chapter of history is read by generations not yet born, on Earth or somewhere else, humanity isn't remembered as a species that almost made it, but as one that refused to quit. He's the first to admit it's not healthy. The hours, the intensity, the need to outwork, outthink, outdream everyone else. It's not balanced. It's not graceful. But that's the burden he's chosen. Not because he craves legacy, but because the alternative, doing nothing, keeps him up at night more than any launch window ever could. And so he watches the failures. Not because he enjoys the pain, but because it keeps him honest. It keeps him hungry. And above all, it keeps him from becoming the very thing he fears most, a man who stopped asking what if. It would be easy, comforting even, to frame this as a story about a billionaire and his toys. A man so rich he could afford to throw money into the sky until something finally stayed up there. That's the version some newspapers went with. The one where risk is just a temporary inconvenience when your bank account has 9 zeros. But that's not the real story. Not even close. The real story is far more fragile. It's about a man who had enough money to retire 10 times over, but instead chose to sit in the blast radius of his own ambition. Elon Musk could have bought yachts, islands, or influence. Instead, he bought time. Time for humanity to catch up to its own potential. And the currency he used wasn't just dollars. It was sleepless nights, fractured relationships, and the slow erosion of his public image. It was walking into rooms full of brilliant people and convincing them to bet their futures on a dream even he didn't fully know how to achieve. What separates Elon from others isn't the size of his vision, it's the magnitude of his willingness to suffer for it. Most people flirt with bold ideas. Elon married them, knowing full well they might leave him broke and broken. He didn't just stake his fortune on rockets. He staked his name, his sanity, his place in history. And when the world mocked him, when each failure seemed to say, "Turn back," he didn't. He paused maybe, swore under his breath, but he kept walking forward anyway. And that walk, that relentless, awkward, brilliant march into the unknown, is what built belief. Belief wasn't automatic. It wasn't owed to him. It had to be earned, clawed from the jaws of disaster one iteration at a time. When Falcon 1 blew up on the pad, belief was a smoking crater. When Falcon 9 succeeded, it was rebuilt, not with applause, but with quiet nods and cautious hope. Elon's greatest invention wasn't a reusable rocket. It was the idea that impossible things might just be possible if you're willing to hurt for them. He taught people, engineers, investors, students, dreamers, that failure doesn't mean you're done. It means you're trying something that matters. That progress isn't always clean or polite. Sometimes it's explosive. Sometimes it's humiliating. But if you can survive it, if you can endure the burn of doubt and keep going, the world starts to shift around you. There's a famous photo of Elon standing beside the Falcon 9 after one of its early landings, his arms crossed, his face calm, almost casual. What that photo doesn't show is what came before it, the thousands of hours spent in testing bays, the tears shed behind closed doors, the emails sent at 3:17 a.m. with subject lines like urgent, booster anomaly. That picture is not a celebration. It's a scar, a reminder that belief often comes dressed as exhaustion. Because belief, real belief, is inconvenient. It costs more than you think it will. And for Elon, it nearly cost everything. But that cost, that pressure, is what shaped him. Every launch, every crash, every dollar lost and friendship strained, it refined him like fire refines steel. It burned away the excess and left behind someone unshakable. Not unbreakable, he'd admit to being broken more than once, but unshakable in purpose. And what is that purpose really? Not just to go to Mars. That's the headline, but the heart of it is deeper. Elon wants to give humanity options. A plan B. A way to stretch beyond this pale blue before we run out of chances. He's not doing it because it's profitable, though it might be. He's doing it because it might matter in a way few things ever do. He often says he wants to wake up every day and be excited about the future. That's the North Star behind everything he does. Whether it's rockets, cars, solar panels, or brain chips, it's all part of the same question. Can we build a tomorrow worth looking forward to? That kind of belief is contagious. Not always comfortable, but undeniably powerful. It inspires people to leave safe jobs and join startups with no guarantees. It inspires kids to build model rockets in their garages. It inspires engineers to rewrite what's possible. And it turns one man's obsession into a collective movement. So yes, Elon Musk built rockets. But more importantly, he built belief in a cynical age that desperately needed it. He made it okay to dream recklessly again. To stare at Mars and think, maybe. To fail and keep going. To question the limits we've quietly accepted. In the end, belief isn't a switch you flip. It's a fire you tend. And through every setback, every sleepless night, and every sarcastic headline, Elon kept it burning. And because he did, now so many others do too. And here's the twist. SpaceX wasn't Elon Musk's backup plan. It wasn't some late-stage vanity project or a footnote after PayPal. It was always his plan A. From the moment he left South Africa, from the day he stepped onto North American soil with that stubborn spark in his eyes, Elon had one obsession: push humanity forward. The internet, PayPal, the money? Those were stepping stones. He didn't want to disrupt finance. He wanted to leave the planet. The idea that private citizens could build rockets used to be a punchline. Literally, it featured in cartoons, sitcoms, and late-night monologues. But Elon refused to laugh. He saw it as inevitable. If no one else would do it, then he would. And not with a trust fund safety net or some quiet, behind-the-scenes advisory role. No, he would put everything on the line. His money, his health, his reputation, his time with his children, his marriage. All of it. Not because he was reckless, but because he was resolute. The failed launches, the ones that exploded in dramatic fireballs, captured on grainy cameras and dissected by every armchair engineer online, weren't just technological failures. They were public humiliations. They were memes. They were symbols of overreach. But Elon never looked away. In fact, he rewatched them. Not as punishment, but as fuel. Not to glorify failure, but to study it. Because to him, failure was feedback in its rawest form. "There is no textbook for what we're trying to do," he once told his team. So the rocket is the textbook, and every time it blows up, it teaches us something. By the time Falcon 1 finally reached orbit, SpaceX was days away from bankruptcy. Most people don't realize how close it came, hours, not months. But Elon always knew. That last launch wasn't just a mission. It was a last breath. It was a poker game with no cards left to play. And still, somehow, he won. But that victory didn't soften him. It sharpened him. He understood that success, when it comes too easy, breeds arrogance. When it comes too hard, it breeds discipline. And Elon had become the most disciplined dreamer in the world. SpaceX wasn't created for Wall Street. It wasn't designed for quarterly profits or flashy product reveals. It was a cathedral built in a warehouse. A testament to faith, not in God, but in humanity's potential. To Elon, Mars was never about escape. It was about expansion, about proving that we are not trapped by our past or our gravity, that we can become a multi-planetary species not out of desperation, but out of determination. And yet, through it all, Elon never tried to seem heroic. He often seemed tired, irritable, even awkward. He gave interviews where he paused too long, spoke too bluntly, or cried unexpectedly. That was the paradox. The man building interplanetary transport systems was often just barely holding himself together. But maybe that's what made it real. Maybe that's why people followed him, not just as employees, but the public. Because he was flawed. Because he was afraid. Because he admitted over and over that he might fail and still kept going. He didn't hide the weight of his ambition. He carried it like a worn backpack, straps digging into his shoulders. And every now and then, he'd turn around and ask, "You coming?" That's what SpaceX represented. Not just rockets, but resilience. The belief that failure isn't final. That limits aren't fixed. That one person's relentless conviction can reshape what the rest of us believe is possible. And so, when people watched those boosters land upright on ocean barges, or when they saw a Tesla Roadster drifting through space, they weren't just watching engineering feats. They were watching the payoff of brutal persistence. The quiet message behind each frame was this: don't wait for permission. Don't let failure stop you. Don't quit when the world laughs. SpaceX wasn't born from comfort. It was forged in chaos. It rose from the wreckage of broken marriages, canceled contracts, and viral explosions. It survived on duct tape, ramen noodles, and the sheer will of people who believed that tomorrow could be better if someone was brave enough to build it. And here's what you might not expect: that belief wasn't always shared. Elon wasn't universally admired. He was mocked, hated, and doubted. He still is. But he never needed universal praise. He just needed enough people to keep building. Because Elon understood something most of us forget: progress isn't polite. It's messy, loud, inconvenient. It doesn't ask for applause. It demands sacrifice. And most of all, it demands someone to go first, to leap while everyone else hesitates. He leaped. He stumbled. He bled. And somehow he landed. So if you ever find yourself on the edge of something scary, an idea, a dream, a challenge so big it swallows sleep and sanity, remember this: SpaceX wasn't Plan B. It was Plan A, the whole time. The money? He spent it. The critics? He outlasted them. The odds? He ignored them. Because in the end, Elon Musk didn't just build rockets. He built belief in himself, in his team, in the idea that ordinary people, driven by an extraordinary mission, can do the impossible. And maybe that's the lesson worth holding on to. You don't need permission to dream big. You just need the courage to keep launching, even when it feels like you've already crashed. Especially then. If you've made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person who understands that behind every breakthrough, there's a story most people never hear. So tell me, where are you watching from? What's your impossible dream? I'd love to know. Not because of the algorithm, but because maybe, just maybe, someone else reading your comment needs to be reminded that they're not the only one still reaching for the stars. Go ahead. Let's build something bigger together.